really always an honor to be at the Montana Historical Society, whether I'm doing research or talking with good history buffs like you. This latest book is, in one sense, it's the final in a trilogy that relates Montana and the Civil War. But in another sense, it's a tribute to the Upper Missouri, to Fort Benton, and yet it does range throughout the state, the later state, certainly throughout the territory. This is a wonderful lithograph that was drawn by Gustav Sohn when he arrived with John Mullen in 1860, August 1st of 1860. The Mullen expedition completed the 624-mile wagon road from Fort Walla Walla, the head of navigation on the Columbia River, to Fort Benton, of course, head of navigation on the Missouri River. And let me see if I can get rid of that little artifact there. Not being a PC person. Yeah, good. And I thought that paired well, that lithograph that depicted the first arrival of steamboats in the spring of 1860 at the levee in Fort Benton, with this incredible painting, I think, that Charlie Fritz of Billings did just maybe 10 years ago. And if you come to Fort Benton, to the Montana State Agricultural Museum, which goes by Museum of the Northern Great Plains for some reason. I think they thought that if you had agriculture in the title of a museum, it wouldn't draw, and it might not nationally, but it certainly does bring Montanans. And next to that museum is a room that houses the 6 bison that William Hornaday captured in 1886 and put together as a display at the Smithsonian. And the idea that Hornaday had, as well as the Smithsonian, was that the buffalo was fast disappearing from the northern plains. Certainly, it was in the last years of the free-roaming bison in Montana, and they'd already pretty well disappeared from Western Canada. And so for many years, the Smithsonian perpetuated the memory of the bison. Fortunately, they were not all killed. Most were, but enough were saved that you can find quite a resurgence around the northern plains today. And Charlie Fritz painted this, and it came to Fort Benton in a kind of a fun fashion, and that was that in the Charles M. Russell auction in March, which is really a big deal in both Great Falls and Montana, frankly, and has grown into an internationally prominent auction. This painting of Charlie's was one of the several hundred items on auction. And the couple that bought it, I believe, were from Havre, although I think they go as an anonymous donor. But they wound up with the high bid, and in doing so, they turned to the director of the Charlie Russell Museum and said, Lauren Render, what are we going to do with this? It's too big for our living room. And he said, why don't you give it to the museums in Fort Benton? And that's one of these fun ways that you get something. A couple of years ago, Charlie visited our research center, the one that Kirby and most people have difficulty pronouncing, the Overholzer Historical Research Center, and he was spending a day going through our photos and selecting out those that he might get ideas from for future paintings. And so it was really a fun day with a very fine artist joining us. And before he left, we went over and he stood before this and told us the story of why it occurred. And it was because he had been on the upper Missouri River, and had encountered exactly the same environmental conditions with the very stormy, cloudy weather, and then suddenly sun and rainbow breaking through. And he just added the steamboat Benton II, which was one of the biggest haulers of freight during the 1870s. And so this really makes a great tribute both to the upper Missouri and to the steamboat era, which is another theme in this book that I downplayed really in the other two, the first one being Montana Territory in the Civil War. And the idea in that book, really, some of you I know have heard this story, but bear with me because I started thinking about Montana and the Civil War because in 2011, when the sesquicentennial rolled around, people were telling me, I was wondering what Montana was going to do, even in a small way, to match the huge outflow of talks and commemorations and everything through the center and the eastern part of the U.S. And Montanans were saying, well, Civil War didn't mean anything to us. We didn't have any big battles here, and so on. And I knew I disagreed with that, but I wanted to put together something that, as a historian, I felt I'd have confidence would present the case of why should we care about Civil War. So I did that, and it came out from the History Press in 2013. And in the meantime, I'd been writing columns a short column for the Great Falls Tribune and a long one for the Fort Benton River Press each month. And frankly, it turned into an endurance test because I kept it up until May of 2015, which is when one of the people I'm going to talk about was captured, and that's Jeff Davis. That was after Lee had surrendered at Appomattox and so on. And that book just, I think, lit a spark in Montana. Everything from a recreation or a reenactment group started, and they tell me that it was largely because of the ideas that I'd presented in the book, and that was, and it's still active. The leader of it moved from Havre to Missoula, but they're still active, and they are the first and only reenactors of Civil War, everything, medicine and infantry and so on. And they chose a group that I featured, and that was the 1st U.S. Volunteer Infantry, which was fascinating to me because the very first troops, other than those passing through, like Lewis and Clark or Captain John Mullen and his military support group during the building of the road. So there had been military through what became Montana Territory, but there hadn't been any stationed here. Well, in the spring, in the April, May, June period of 1865, from one of the Dakota forts came 12 enlisted and a lieutenant that were from the 1st U.S. Volunteer Infantry. They had acquired the name along the way of the galvanized Yankees, and they got that name because all of the enlisted, the 12 enlisted guys, had been Confederate prisoners of war held in Fort Lookout prison, Union prison in Maryland, and had been offered the opportunity to, this was in 1864-65, before the end of the war, to volunteer for U.S. Union service. And they recruited 6 regiments and sent them to the Dakota forts, which of course were then pretty heavily engaged, especially with the Sioux, which had been pushed out of Minnesota and were causing serious conflicts with settlers and so on. So anyway, the galvanized Yankee idea, those came to Fort Benton to guard freight for several months that summer of 1865. Well, the next year, of course, there were more troops that came into Montana Territory. The war was over, and even though the size of the army had been cut drastically, they brought the beginning of the Indian Wars military into Montana Territory with found the location that was at the mouth of the Judith, and it was Camp Cook. And Camp Cook very quickly was relocated to Fort Shaw. There are still buildings. In fact, I stopped by today on my way over here. Several of the original buildings at Fort Shaw still stand. The unique feature with those buildings is that they have adobe walls encased in wood frame buildings. If they hadn't been in wood frame buildings, of course, the adobe would long since. Adobe was mud, essentially, mud with straw put in, and it was a pretty good clay base to the mud. But and we've had problems at Fort Shaw with one wall threatening to collapse, so we've taken out about a 10-foot by 8-foot portion of the adobe wall, and that's what I was looking at today. It's pretty fascinating to see a modern Montana structural technician trying to work with adobe. He's a brave soul, because I think he's probably the only one in Montana that would have been willing to take on a job, and he's also going to have to fabricate some. Most of the brick, they call them, the adobe blocks, came out intact. A lot of them were cracked, even standing in the structure. So anyway, a little deviation. I think I'd emphasize that part of the tribute to Fort Benton in the book is both related to steamboats, but also related to the, I guess you could call it the lifestyle in the mid-1860s, a time when Madam Mustache was, who had gone from gold camp to gold camp, from California to Nevada up to Virginia City, and by 1867 she was operating out of the second floor of the Cosmopolitan, running her joint night and day during the steamboating season when miners were pouring in to go downriver on the boats, or miners and their families and merchants and so on were pouring upriver to go into the mining camps that, of course, had begun at Gold Creek and then Bannock, and then by 1867, all the rest really were underway. The first big ones like Alder Gulch and Last Chance Gulch and Confederate Gulch and so on. So during that mid-1860s period, this town that hadn't been there before but had just been a trading post for furs and robes with the American Fur Company sprung up, and it became a really lively place in that period. And this is 1867, when Madam Mustache was here. She probably was sitting at her window carrying on her card games at the very time when Thomas Francis Meagher was going off the second deck of the G.A. Thompson steamboat. So, you just can imagine what kind of lively operations, not a lot of murders, but there were, and a lot of chaos in general at Old Fort Benton. The book I tried to, I wanted to answer, as Kirby mentioned, I think it was Phil Alberg that said that I'm a historian of lost and neglected Montana history, that I do focus on that. And frankly, that's true. Since I got moved back to Montana, I looked very closely at what had been done by Joel Overholzer, who was a journalistic historian, ran the River Press, and others around the central Montana area, and for that matter, around the state over time. And I found that African Americans didn't live in Montana because you'd find no evidence in any of the histories. Chinese, well, they were a little more interesting, so maybe there'd be a fun anecdote about some outrageous prank being paid to the Chinese that lived they lived in every mining camp. And in Fort Benton, in that 60s, 70s, and even as late as 1923, there was a Chinese colony in Fort Benton. Now, nobody wrote about them in particular. And so anyway, and women's history, the thing that took me into participating in Martha Cole's wonderful project a year ago, well, I guess 2 years ago now, that turned into the book this summer, From Schoolmarms to Madams, was because I have felt that women were pretty much left out of Montana history also, except maybe, Jeanette Rankin and a few others that you do hear a lot about. So part of what I do in general is seek out stories that are interesting, stories that have some impact and are important, but are not all white male. And I certainly try to avoid the ones that have been written and rewritten. And I mean, I might write about Plummer and the Vigilantes, but I do it in the context of, and actually I do it in my first book, and that is in the context of the first Confederate prisoner of war to come to Montana Territory. Well, he was part of the original 7 that met the night of the Ives trial in Virginia City. And oh, by the way, Wilberforce Sanders, the prosecutor at the trial, stayed at Captain Nick Wall's home, and Nick Wall being the Confederate prisoner that had signed a parole that banished him to the Western Territories, and he honored it. He didn't go back into the Confederate Army. So a story like that, where Nick Wall, who emerges as an amazing person and yet didn't leave a family in Montana, hasn't been written time and again about, that's the kind of story I really enjoy. But I also wanted to just really quickly say that in this book, I've taken on 10 fundamental questions, and I'll just run through them briefly, and several of them I'm going to go into more detail on in the talk. What was the role of steamboats in the Civil War? And the first several chapters relate to that. They were hugely important in the Civil War, and they were, of course, just beginning to come up the upper Missouri to what became Montana Territory in '64, but the steamboats had been trying to come, or had succeeded in coming, ever since 1860, when those 2 you saw on the lithograph first arrived. What role did steamboats play in the settlement of Montana Territory? And I do spend a fair amount of time in the book taking a look at how relating steamboat transportation and what it brought in terms of passengers and freight and so on to Fort Benton, or at least to the upper Missouri. A lot of times the boats didn't make it that far. They might stall out at Cow Island, and some of them later in each steamboat season may never make it much past, let's say, the Milk River, and they'd have to leave their cargo and then laboriously freight it. But at the height of the steamboat season, when as many as 6 and on one occasion 8 steamboats, and these were boats that were 200, 250 feet in length, carrying anywhere from 150 to 300 tons of cargo. It's astounding that these boats could fight their way all the way from St. Louis, and later in the 60s, of course, the railroads after the war began being extended to Sioux City and eventually to Bismarck, so it shortened the trip greatly for the steamboat. So, and oh, by the way, what was it like to come up the Missouri River in the 1860s on a steamboat? And I pick one young lady, Rosalie Ruthyn, and I can't find much on her, but what I have found is that for some incredible reason, the Missouri Republican, one of the 2 big papers in St. Louis, carried a series of 6 of her letters about her trip up the Missouri River to Fort Benton, and then right back down on the same steamboat. And along the way, she's the most opinionated, sharp, interested in learn. I mean, the whole event was, on her part, was to learn. And boy, did she share what she learned along the way, including some pretty exciting things. And yet her story had never been published beyond 1866, was when she made the trip in the Missouri Republican. So, and I also answer a question that kind of near and dear to my heart, and this one I'll go into more detail, and it's, why do I use the term cradled in Dixie? Well, we'll leave that for a bit. What were General Alfred Terry's last orders to Colonel George Armstrong Custer? That was debated from the 1876 when Custer and his men were killed until, well, really in some sense until today. 1970s, 1980s, John Mannion and several historians revised all that, and they did it based on some pretty fascinating testimony by a young African-American woman who had been Custer's cook on the Bighorn expedition. She'd also been with Custer on his Dakota expedition. But good heavens, there was actually, a 20-something-year-old cook that went with Custer. Now, she, of course, wasn't killed. She stayed with the Far Western Steamboat and so on. So I'll have more on that. And what some of you certainly know this, what did Captain Grant Marsh and his steamer Far West do in the aftermath of the Battle of the Little Bighorn? Amazing story. Grant Marsh, I'll talk a little more about him later. And of course up here, those that you really know, outlaws in the 1860s and 70s, especially in Missouri, know these are Jesse and Frank James. And there's been a legend since I was growing up on a farm in Choteau County, Montana, that the James brothers had come to Montana Territory at some point. But I've never found anybody that took it on and said, what is the evidence? So this book does exactly that. And I guess I could say it this way. I don't care whether it was the biggest or the smallest battle or the least important or the most important event throughout the Civil War. Somebody who later came to Montana Territory participated in it. Now, nobody up until when I went to work on my first book paid much attention to ferreting out the stories behind it. And one of those stories we knew a fair amount about, and it was one of the most prominent Indian Wars guys. He belonged to the 7th Infantry. Technically, he was under the regiment at Fort Shaw, but he was the military post commander at Fort Benton for about 6 years in the 70s, and it was Major Guido Illgo. Well, I started looking into what did good old Guido do during the Civil War, and I found this amazing story of Lincoln arrives in Washington and the White House and has to sneak through Baltimore, where the Confederates were almost in control. They certainly had a major presence. And he went into the White House, and there was virtually no security. And Senator Joe Lane, who'd been an abolitionist in Kansas and had been elected to the Senate and just had arrived a little bit before Lincoln, I think, in the D.C. area, formed a Frontier Guards organization of Indiana, Illinois, if there were any, Kansas, but local guys that he felt he could trust and have confidence in and that were loyal to the Union. And he formed the Frontier Guards. And for the first weeks and months of the Civil War, most of the security of the White House was Colonel Joe Lane and and his frontier guards. One of those guards was Major Guido Illgo, who was a private at that time, but made his participation in the first 6 weeks or so of the war so important to both Joe Lane and even to President Lincoln that Lincoln granted him a direct captain's commission in the 14th U.S. Infantry, so in the regular army. So, instead of picking Guido Illgo up and his Indian War story, which is pretty exciting and pretty interesting in itself, you have all that Civil War role that he played, and he played a big role. He was one of the heroes in the disaster at Chancellorsville and in various other major engagements. And anyway, and finally, what Montanan led the most important manhunt or most famous manhunt in American history? Of course, that manhunt is for John Wilkes Booth, assassin of Abraham Lincoln. And leave it to future Montanans to be the leader in that operation. I'll talk more about him. I wanted to start with the individual stories a bit about one of my all-time favorite Montana heroes or heroines, and this is the daughter of Sidney Edgerton, the first territorial governor. She came to Bannock with the Edgerton family in 1863 as a 13-year-old. And although she went back with the family when he was relieved and succeeded as governor to get an education, she never really left Montana, and she came back with her husband in 1875. He was actually one of the first heads of the school system in Helena. Then they moved on to Fort Benton in 1879, and then when the new fledgling little town of Paris Gibson started at Great Falls in 1884, they moved in there. Their story's been lost, and yet she did just little things like when her husband, at age 45, poor Herbert Percy Rolfe, died of typhoid fever suddenly, leaving her with 7 small children, she took over editorship of the Great Falls Leader, which was tooth and nail fighting with the Great Falls Tribune as a major daily newspaper. It was the Republican paper, Tribune was the Democrat newspaper. For 18 months, Maddie, as I call her, it's Martha Edgerton Rolfe, operated that, or was the editor and hands-on editor too. They all said that she was very actively engaged and actually improved that paper. So Maddie's story is pretty amazing, and yet it's really been lost. The part of her story that I pick up in the book, and I'm not going to have time to read, I think, all the things I was planning on, but in 1881, they were living in Fort Benton. She had not been back to Ohio, where the Edgerton family lived, Akron, since they'd come in the 1870s. So it was a good time. Steamboats were routinely coming and going, so she took the first one that year with 2 small daughters, the 2 small children she had in 1879, and hopped on the steamboat Far West. Now, Grant Marsh was not the captain at that point. He had moved on to other boats, but she learned the history behind the famed Far West. There were also many passengers on board, officers and their wives, and some that weren't officers enlisted from Fort Assiniboine that were, steamboats brought all the military, the recruits and all the military in and out of Montana Territory until the Northern Pacific arrived. And oh, by the way, steamboats brought all the Northwest Mounted Police recruits into southwestern Canada until the Central Pacific Railroad arrived in 1883. So here's 1881. Maddie is on board the Far West. They're going downriver, and she writes some stories about the trip. And as they got toward Fort Union had been replaced at that point by the military post Fort Buford, they were getting rumors that they were going to be taking on board Indians to take down. Sitting Bull's surrendered element that had been up in Canada. So 3 steamboats, the Yellowstone, the Far West, and I think it was the General Sherman, all rendezvoused at Fort Buford and took on this curious Sitting Bull crowd. Maddie writes, it was sunset as we approached Fort Berthold, which was down in the Dakotas, and they were on the way to drop the Indians off at Standing Rock Agency. Before us spread a glorious red sky down to the horizon, towards which the boat was headed. "Come up to the Texas," said one of my friends. The Texas being the captain's cabin on some boats. Most boats didn't have the Texas, but this one did. "And hear the Indians sing." I gladly followed her aloft, where half a dozen men were singing and indulging in some primitive dance steps, wholly oblivious to the audience surrounding them. They swayed gently side to side, now and then turning around, and meanwhile chanting what sounded like, "Hi-yi-yi, you've been to powwows, right?" Repeated again and again. Their voices were good, and I discovered there was a real melody to what they sang. They sang because they were approaching an enemy's. Someone said they sang because they were approaching an enemy's country. There they stood, their splendid, almost naked forms outlined against the glowing sunset. As they sang, shrill boys' voices from the lower deck took up the burden of the song in another key, but with similar intervals. It was a concert never to be forgotten, on a stage impossible of reproduction, and hung with curtains of a celestial hue. Martha was a good writer, very talented lady. She later, by the way, totally off the subject except on Martha's subject or Maddie's subject, from 1918 to 1936 when she passed away, she wrote the darndest amazing collection of Montana history through the Montana Newspaper Association, which was one of these early services. It was centered in Great Falls. Chile and Rabin operated it. And they'd prepare 4 pages for all the weekly newspapers. And there were, I don't know, a couple hundred in Montana that carried it. Even a few dailies picked up at least some of their... And embedded in those 4 pages, in addition to some of the latest news and a lot of ads and some kind of stock things, were these amazing stories. Grace Stone Coates wrote for them, and Maddie wrote more than anybody else. So Maddie got her girls down, and they had the reunion with the Edgerton family, and came back up before the end of the season and rejoined the family. I wanted to just really briefly read one of the early reviews of Yankees and Rebels by, I think, one of Montana's real gems, and he's a chronicler in his own right. Ed Kemick used to write the City Lights column for the Billings Gazette, and I think he felt he outgrew that, and he now has an online news service. He and David Crisp and a number of others write actively for, and it's called The Last Best News. If you ever want to follow some fun stories that come up weekly, just put Last Best News in Google and you'll get it, including this one that Ed wrote about the book, which he called Author Sifts Gems from Montana History. And he writes that the great value in Robison's growing collection of books about Fort Benton in Upper Missouri, or his tireless research unearthing buried nuggets of known or forgotten Montana history. And then he goes through, went through Maddie's story and several others, including the one I'm going to talk a little bit about now. And that's, I think it was way back in the 1950s when I was in high school in Great Falls. I read in the Montana Parade, that wonderful insert section that used to be in the Great Falls Tribune. I read about this book that was coming out, and one of the pages was titled "Book Throws New Light on Custer's Life," and so on. And it was to be a book called "Cradled in Dixie." I'm kind of feeling my bit of a sore throat, so excuse me. Anyway, Cradled in Dixie was kind of a fascinating title, and it was going to be a book by a Great Falls writer, Florence Franklin, that recalled some memories she had as a girl in Belt about Maddie Kastner, who is one of the at the Capitol, one of the outstanding in the gallery of outstanding Montanans, as the mother of Belt. Maddie Kastner was a black woman. She married John Kastner, a white man, and they founded this town that grew into a heck of a coal mining town, and later faded to now it's kind of a neat suburb of Great Falls. A lot of people live there and work in Great Falls. But in Maddie Kastner's day, John, her husband, had grown up in Pennsylvania. He knew coal mining probably better than about anybody else around, and he found coal big time, and he started mining it, and he later associated with the Anaconda and sold it and so on. But their hotel in Belt was legendary. The restaurant and hotel they had, stages all stopped there and so on. Anyway, I was really looking forward to this exciting book that through 4 pages of the Montana Parade were being announced as imminently being published. Well, I never could find it. I mean, I didn't find it in my maybe 8 more years in Montana, high school and the university, and I got back here periodically, and I was always interested in history and so on, and yet I never could. And then when the internet came about, I could search ABE books and all the search engines that can present books from about every direction. There never was a Cradled in Dixie. There never was a Florence Franklin book. Well, I got back to Montana and doing a lot of research at the Great Falls Public Library, and there in the vertical files at the Great Falls Public Library was a copy, this is the actual copy, of the Montana Parade article with this writing on it that says, "This book has not been published. Mrs. Franklin told me in June 1970 the Kastner heirs threatened her with a lawsuit if she published because the descendants did not want to be earmarked as having Negro blood." A.J., well, that's Alma Jacobs, the first African-American librarian in Montana, appointed in 1956. She really was maybe, except for a few pioneers like Bickford and others that have been written about, Alma was a professional woman. There were no professional women. There were barely any professional black men in Montana as late as the 1850s or 1950s. Historians always go back to the 18. But anyway, this solved the mystery of why that book never came out. And it's one of those stories that is in, I have 4 parts in the book. One part is called Cradled in Dixie. And another part of that is the story of Maria Adams and her sister Mary. Maria later married Duke de Trille, who's pretty well known in Helena here, a very colorful barber in downtown Helena in the 1880s. And then the family moved on to Marysville for a short period and then on to Belt, where they lived the rest of their life. And that's how Florence Franklin got to, as a young woman or young girl really, got to know Maria Adams Dutrille and Maddie Kastner. They were both still living when Florence was growing up. So the book was going to be about Maria Adams and Maddie Kastner. Well, fortunately, part of Maria Adams' story made it into another obscure publication, which is the Great Falls Yesterday, published by the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, in 1939, called Great Falls Yesterday. And it's the amazing compilation of family stories and the history of the area. It goes way back before the formation of Great Falls. That's why it's kind of mistitled, because it's got history going back to the 1860s and 70s, long before Great Falls was formed. Well, that book had, very unusual for those days, it had the stories of 5 black women. It also had the stories of a couple black men. It had stories about Chinese. So who should be the editor and the prime mover behind Great Falls Yesterday? Well, it was Edith Rolfe Maxwell, daughter of Martha Edgerton Rolfe. She, I'm sure, had access to, by then her mother had died, 1936. This was 39 when she did the book. So fortunately, although the story that Florence Franklin would have presented has been lost, and I've been in touch with their descendants, the kids, and they can't find any of her manuscripts or notes or anything. So Florence Franklin's work apparently has been lost. But we do know some about Maria Adams. Well, Maria and her sister Mary had been, I believe, free blacks, and that's really been hard to pin down. It was a nuclear family, and it had to have been a free black family in Kentucky. They could not have been slaves. The slave families got so fractured and spread around. But anyway, Maria and Mary, first Mary, who was a very fine cook, was hired by George Custer. And so from the time that Custer was in his last year or so with the 7th Cavalry down in Kentucky on Reconstruction duty until when they got shifted up to Fort Abraham Lincoln for the Indian Wars part of his career, first Mary as the cook and then later as a housemaid, the younger sister, Maria, worked for Elizabeth Custer. Mary had been taken off with Custer on his Dakota campaign I mentioned earlier. She was also taken on the Bighorn campaign. And the story of what she heard in the tent on the shore with the steamer far west nearby, the last night that Terry and Gibbon and Custer and so on had their last meeting, was taken down as testimony in 1879 by Nelson Miles, none other than General Miles, and had for a long time been discredited, but had been revisited and has really become, I think, accepted since John Mannion and others took up the whole case in the 1970s and 80s. And the whole story behind that's in here. I don't have time to go into it more than to say that she heard Terry's last orders to Custer, and they weren't the same, as history had been carrying for decades before. So, pretty interesting bit of history. Far West, great boat. Grant Marsh. Grant Marsh was the king of the Upper Missouri. He was also the king of the Yellowstone. If there was a mutiny on a steamboat, say around Cow Island or maybe downriver a ways from Cow Island, and the crew took over the boat, who would they send to go tackle the problem? They'd send Grant Marsh. And what I've done in here, I do have a chapter on Grant Marsh. I also have, year by year as captain, the amazing feats. You know, most of the captains, they were all good or they didn't last, because Missouri River was a heck of a navigation challenge, and most of these captains had been pilots, and some of them served as their own pilots afterward because they were better than anybody else, and Grant Marsh was the best. But he could take a boat out of the Dakotas that was almost iced in late October and managed to free it and get it down the river. Nobody else could do that. And it was true with just year after year, the challenges that guy had were pretty amazing. I guess I will have to let you read about the rest of his exploits in the book. Thank you, Bill Riley, for killing everybody except Booth off. They left Booth for me to kill off. Why not? I mean, at least he died. I didn't especially like O'Reilly's way of handling killing Reagan and some of the other things. But this is a story that, you know, you hear about it. Appomattox occurs a week later. Lincoln's assassinated at the Ford Theater. John Wilkes Booth jumps after shooting Lincoln and fractures a leg. Well, thank goodness he did, because it took a while to get the pursuit organized. But they did get it organized, and they got it organized with some real Montana connections. Number two in the fledgling Secret Service at that point was this Colonel Everton Conger. Conger had been seriously wounded in 3 different major engagements, so badly wounded that he could not, for the 4th time, go back into combat. So they made him the number 2 in the Secret Service, guarding the president at that point and doing the security things around Washington. So the War Department appointed Conger to lead the pursuit, and he was masterful. He picked up every clue and led the pursuit. But he also had a small military element with him. It was 25 men under a lieutenant. They were from the 16th New York Cavalry. Well, the commander, who was not one of the group, but these were his men, was Colonel Nelson Schweitzer. Schweitzer brought one of my 5 black women up the Missouri on a steamboat with his children, took her to Fort Ellis when he took command of the 2nd Cavalry after Baker was relieved, and so on. So even the 16th New York Cavalry had a fascinating later Montana connection. Well, the pursuit, you know, most people know quite a bit about it. It basically followed the pattern here. They surrounded the barn at Garrett's farm after some pretty skillful sleuth work, and Conger, in his later reports, wrote that he'd ordered a fire started to burn the barn and forced Booth and his accomplice David Harold to surrender. He stated that Booth knew that the end was near. Harold surrendered, and then, in the words of Conger, righting himself on his feet, Booth plunged toward the door Against all orders, Sergeant Boston Corbett, who was with the 16th New York Cavalry and a Canadian, shot Booth in the neck. The wound proved fatal, and Booth whispered to Conger his final message for his mother, quote, "I did it for my country. Tell my mother that what I did was for the best," unquote. Lincoln's assassin was dead. Of course, Booth's action was not in the best interest of the South, and many Southern leaders quickly recognized that fact. Post-Reconstruction without President Abraham Lincoln proved a long downhill slope for the nation, but that's another story. So with that, I think I'm basically out of time except to give you a few minutes to ask questions. I'd be glad to answer or tackle.